Sacred Space.
And welcome back to the second part of Sacred Space on West Limerick 102. My name is Shane Ambers and I'm here with John Keeley this morning. And as John said at the top of the programme, Sacred Space is on the road this morning because we went to Limerick, to the new diocesan office, to have a chat this morning with our guest, who of course is Bishop Brendan Leahy. Good morning, Bishop Brendan.
Good morning to you, Shane.
And welcome back again. It's a while since we managed to get you into Sacred Space.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. That's the important thing.
Excellent, excellent. Now, as listeners will remember, from time to time we ask Bishop Brendan to come on and to talk to us about how things are in the state of the diocese. And of course, this year in particular, Bishop Brendan's been clocking up the media miles because, of course, he's launched a new pastoral, which is moving forward together pastoral units and team ministry. So we wanted to talk to him about this morning and ask him a couple of questions in relation to it. So, Bishop Brendan, this is a big change for the diocese. Someone said to me the other day, it's probably the biggest change structurally since the restoration of the hierarchy. I thought that was a big claim to fame, but I thought it was an interesting one.
I think it would be probably too big a claim to fame, but it is an important step, a very important step. What we've decided now, after many years of thinking about this, we had a synod, of course, in 2016, and out of that came our pastoral plan, where we said we would move in the direction of pastoral ministry. We've had to look and say, well, okay, looking at things going forward, how should we shape the diocese? What parishes are linked together? And we've tried our best to kind of come up with parishes that are linked geographically primarily, and then I suppose in terms of ministry and priesthood, to try and see how that can be arranged in a way that will work going forward.
And so what we have what are called the establishment of pastoral units, where we have basically, is it clustered kind of more formally parishes together?
That's right. We have 16 units, with 2 of them being sub-units, but basically these are parishes, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever it is, parishes coming together, and they will be now cooperating, collaborating, getting to know each other, working together, and maybe doing joint projects together. That's the idea. And then you'll have the 2 or 3 priests in that whole, let's say, area serving those parishes.
So I was listening to your interview with Joe Nash on Limerick 95 during the week, and I loved the idea you said it was almost going back to the past to get to the future, where parishes, before individual parishes could have had a team of priests, like the parish priest and a couple of curates helping in an individual parish. But in this situation, we're going back to a group of priests serving a group of parishes.
That's right. I mean, in other words, the idea is to go back to the idea that the priest isn't on his own in a parish, that he's together. Now, it isn't that we're going back to the setup of a priest and curates. All of the priests here are co-parish priests, but they're working together as a team. And I suppose that's one of the big things that has been emphasised in the Catholic Church in recent years, the notion of working together. We use the technical term of working together in communion with one another. And that's a big, I think, feature of what the Holy Spirit is trying to say to us today.
In some ways, it's a big change, because I suppose parish priests, to a degree, would have been used to being, if you like the expression, lone rangers and lone wolves. You know, the bishop is the king in his own diocese, the parish priest was the king in his own parish. It's a big change for them.
It is a change, but like true, the bishops, for instance, in the region here in Munster, we now meet much more. We used to meet once a year. We now meet 5 or 6 times a year.
Okay.
The bishops' meetings, we meet 4 times a year. We have a retreat together for a week together as bishops. So as bishops, we are certainly trying to work much more as a team together. And I think right throughout the church, you'll find that happening. It is a change, yes, but I think priests are up to it. I admit it's not always easy for the priests, but it is a new moment, and they recognise we need to do something.
But I suppose for lay people on the ground, I suppose trying to get their heads around it, I suppose a couple of things might come to mind. I suppose the first question, and it's very much tied up, I suppose, with our identity of ourselves, is, are you suppressing parishes?
No, that's not happening. Each parish remains, it has its identity. But, you know, I like to take an example from West Kerry, where my parents are from, and where I suppose in many ways grew up partly. As I grew up in Dublin, but we've spent a lot of time in West Kerry. If you go to West Kerry, technically there's only one parish, Ballyferriter, but everybody knew their local parish where they grew up. We had the Dunquin parish, we had the Martin parish, we had the parish of Moore parish. You know, there was Kilquade parish. There was all the old historical parishes. They still had their identity. In our case, we're not suppressing anything. The parish still actually exists. And I think identity is a question of the mind and of history and of a lot of factors which go together. Whether or not a parish is suppressed is almost secondary.
Okay, so it's an important thing, I suppose, for people to, if you like, it's an opportunity for parishes and for parishioners to kind of say, right, you know, this is our opportunity to say, who are we as a people?
That's right.
Okay.
And the big thing today is, you know, very often, I saw a nice phrase the other day, for young people, this was about young people. The question isn't so much in life, who am I, but who am I for?
That's a good way of putting it. Yeah.
And I think it's true for a parish. If a parish ends up just saying, who am I? And they turn in on themselves, they're not really themselves. A parish exists for. And what we're trying to say is that they're not isolated. They exist with others, for others. And together we're working for the whole church for mission.
Now, just thinking about that, where you have a group of priests working together and, there isn't necessarily a parish priest in each parish. I suppose for older listeners, maybe one of the questions that might come to mind is, right, it's late at night and someone is sick and we need to call for a parish priest to come to, for example, administer the last rites. Who do we call?
Yeah, that arrangement will be worked out locally by all the pastoral units. The priests in the local area will sort that out. It'll be available to people as to who's on duty on what days. That system will still apply. The local priest will solve that. The reality is, of course, that unfortunately now most people ring straight for the ambulance and they're brought straight into the hospital, where we have 2 priests working as chaplains, of course, in the hospital.
Of course. And I'm just wondering, it's a big change, I suppose, in terms of the relationship almost between parish priest and parishioners. I suppose if you think about it, a lot of people, I suppose, when they're getting married, you go for your nuptial inquiry, you have to get, as they say, you have to get your papers. And part of that system, from a church's perspective, not the civil side of it now, but from the church's perspective, relies on a parish priest knowing his parishioners. Is that going to be feasible, do you think, in the new system?
Look, we're moving into new times. We've less people coming to church. We've less people getting married. So, in other words, the amount of people to be known is less. I can't deny that it is a challenge for priests, but the fact of the matter is we have less priests, and that's just the reality. We have 10 parishes at the moment without a resident priest. But my point is, once the system settles down, I think after 2 or 3 years, the priests will be known by the people, and the people will know these are our priests.
And in terms of the system, I suppose it kick-started the first Sunday of Advent, so that was the 2nd of December this year. I suppose, what are the next steps, I suppose, that we're going to start to see? Because the first weekend, priests were moving around, what was the expression? Sharing the altars, I think was the expression. But I suppose, what are the next steps involved? What will people start to see happening?
Well, now we'll have to start building on it. For instance, we wanted to have one pastoral unit for the whole 3 or 4 parishes. That'll have to be created. We have to get involved with the training, for instance, of the priests themselves. How do they work together? What are the questions that are being thrown up by this new arrangement? How do we sort them out? And they were going to have to do work together in the new year about that. We're also going to have to look much more creatively at the role of lay people and how lay people can be exercising a role, a ministry in a parish, such as looking after, for instance, take, for instance, the removal of the remains to a church, that they might say the prayers in the church, or they might be involved in a baptismal team, a central baptismal team for the whole pastoral unit. The baptisms might still take place, of course, in the parish, but there'd be one central baptismal team. Or there might be, in the future, people who will be involved in the training children for the sacraments, helping out in the schools do the sacraments, of course, but you might have people in the parish more directly involved as well, helping them. So that training of lay people, as what we call catechists or pastoral ministry, that's going to have to start clicking in, and we're going to have to find ways of doing that. Now, we have been discussing this with other dioceses to see can we come up with a common formula for all of us.
Now, you raised a couple of points there. I suppose one of the main things you talked about was training, and I suppose the question some people would ask is, how well is the diocese resourced to be able to do that, given currently... is there anyone working at the diocesan office for a pastoral worker? Because I think there's a couple of vacancies.
Well, look, for a start, we're all trying to work together to try and see can we reach on the pastoral plan. So we have somebody directly employed in bringing forward the pastoral plan. So she's involved in that. After that, we have to rely on a lot of volunteer goodwill out in parishes. We have Father Eamon Fitzgibbon, who's the head of the Pastoral Institute in Ireland, which is in Thurles, based in Thurles, but he is one of our own priests. So he's working very closely with me on devising a training programme for catechists going forward.
And in terms of just the ongoing, you mentioned about the pastoral councils there. I suppose some people said, for the pastoral council's point of view, I remember a couple of years ago, each parish was required to have one. So now what happens to those in terms of their coordination within the unit? Yes,
those, basically we're going to have one main pastoral council for the unit, because what we've seen is parishes sometimes find it hard to field a good team, as it were. They have a few people interested or willing to help out, but maybe they find it hard to get a full fully fledged kind of pastoral council in a parish. So we're trying to say is let's have one good pastoral council in the unit, and then there can be groups in parishes. You can call them pastoral groups, leadership groups, mission groups, working groups, whatever you want. That group will be, as it were, the people on the ground who bring things forward in the local parish.
And just in terms of going back to the idea of the parish identity, I suppose one of the questions many people will have, how does it work from a finance point of view?
Yes, at the moment all the parishes remain with their finances.
Okay.
That remains juridically the case.
That's the case, and it's not going to change.
No.
I suppose with this kind of realignment, I suppose another question people might be asking is, well, if we're going to have less clergy, so do we need to reevaluate the assets that we hold across the diocese, and where, if they're sold or disposed of, where does that go?
Well, these are all questions which we will have to be looking at as we go forward, absolutely. These are questions we're going to have to look at together. For instance, there are houses now becoming available where we no longer have priests. At the same time, we have an increasing number of retired priests, so we have to kind of look into their accommodation. How do we provide for their accommodation? So these are questions which we have to look at together going forward.
And I suppose one of the things that comes out of it is, while we have a great turning and rediscovery of the role of the laity in the church, which is feeding into this whole idea of the pastoral units, I suppose one of the questions people are going to say is, well, we still need our priests. At the end of the day, as a church, we still need Eucharist, which is the source and summit of the faith. So I suppose the question to you, Bishop, would be, well, what's our situation in terms of vocations for the diocese? Do we have seminarians?
Well, we have 2 seminarians at the moment, but that's absolutely not sufficient. So we really do have to really work and pray that we're going to have to do that, to work and pray that we get more seminarians. Absolutely. So we try now, for instance, to have a prayer of the faithful at all masses, somewhere on Sundays where there's a prayer for vocations in some way. That's a policy throughout the diocese. Then also I'm hoping shortly to set up a group for young people, young adults, kind of thinking about the future, where, what am I for? That going back to that question, who am I for? That kind of a group that might look at future directions for their own life, to try and encourage people to reflect on what is my calling in life, and hopefully that might trigger a few people into thinking about the vocation to priesthood in our diocese.
At the moment, where are our seminarians training? Is it Rome or is it in Maynooth?
Our 2 seminarians at the moment are trained in Rome.
Which makes sense, I suppose, because we have a man on the ground there in terms of Father Paul Finerte.
Yeah, he's the vice rector of the Irish College in Rome, so yes, that's true too.
But would you have a concern for seminarians that train in Rome that they may become, I suppose the expression local people might say it around in West Limerick would be, they're a bit too Roman, in terms of their training in that regard, in terms of how does that gel with their reality that they're going to face when they come back to minister in the diocese?
Yes, well, I have a belief myself, Rome or otherwise, that nobody should spend all their 7 years in the same seminary, and that would be true for the 2 lads as well.
Okay.
They won't spend all their 7 years in Rome.
Okay, that's very... Do you as Bishop, do you have confidence in Maynooth?
Oh yes, absolutely. Okay. Unfortunately, we have very few students there now.
But I suppose looking at Maynooth from the point of view of the national church, just for a moment, do we think maybe it's time that we need to reconsider the model of seminary formation in its entirety? Is it providing us with, there's the issue of men going forward for discernment, for vocation with the seminary, but the seminary training that they're getting itself, is it sufficient for their human, personal, spiritual, theological, psychological needs as priests for the 21st century? Well,
yes, a new document, what's called a ratio, was produced last year for the whole church, which invites all of us to look again at what is our formation programme for seminarians, what should we be doing, and so in Ireland we have to now come up with our one as well, nationally for Ireland. And I think that provides us with an opportunity to address the very questions you're looking at. How today, what's the best way today to form future priests going forward for the needs of tomorrow? Well, they're already the needs of today, but certainly the needs of tomorrow. We need to be starting now looking at how we're forming priests. So that question is valid.
So potentially could we be looking at maybe the closure of the old Maynooth, as we'd call it, if a new model was put forward?
Yeah, I think at the moment we're not going to say it's this or that. I mean, we will have to sit down and reflect a lot on it, and then see what's the best that can be done in any particular situation. Because naturally, students are going to have to study a bit of theology, and that's going to be an important feature for their formation. We don't have that many places in Ireland teaching theology. So
no, unfortunately, and a lot of them have closed. So, not just for seminarians, but for lay people as well, it's a challenge to find somewhere to.
Now we're very fortunate here in Limerick. We have Mary Immaculate College, which has a good theology department. department. So that's a feather in our cap here in Limerick.
Mm-hmm. In terms of the pastoral units, and coming back to the pastoral units, one of the areas you mentioned there was we will probably get to a stage where certain things that are done by priests at the moment, and you gave the example of the reception of remains at a church, could eventually be done by a lay person. And in other interviews that you've done, you've spoken about the need for this to be discerned by the diocese and by the people and by the community as to who and how this is going to be done. At the moment, across the diocese, we are implementing, or not playing around with, but are using, I should say, beg your pardon, the liturgy of the words led by lay people on an experimental basis. To date, what is your impression of it?
Yeah, well, I'm hearing people say that it takes place maybe one day a week in some of the parishes, and lay people are leading those moments of prayer. I've heard reasonably positive impressions about it. There is a question which some are asking whether or not there should be distribution at those weekday liturgies.
Distribution of Holy Communion.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And what's your own take on it? Was as bishop, what is? If I could put it this way, sometimes things vary from parish to parish. As it stands at the moment, as bishop, what is your view on the policy of distribution of communion at the weekday services?
Yeah, my own view is this, that, well, for a start, we have to look at the whole context of the church and its tradition. I, number one, respect the fact that the very people who go to daily mass are people who have an enormous love for the Eucharist. So this is a very delicate topic, because they're the very ones who have a huge love for the Eucharist. And I can see their desire as a devotion as well to receive the Eucharist every day. And that I appreciate completely. Many saints of that line recommended that, and absolutely, I don't want to take from that. Nevertheless, there is also the fact that we know that there is always a risk, and this has happened in the church in the past, that the Eucharist gets reduced to a thing that you distribute. And that would be damaging for the Eucharist, because the Eucharist ultimately is to always recall the celebration of the sacrifice of Christ at Calvary, and that it's a community that does that in the person of the priest, of course, but the priest in persona Christi offers the sacrifice of the Mass. Community participates in it, and it's in that context the Eucharist is distributed. If you start splitting all that and you start giving out communion, it can lead to dangerous directions. I'll give you an example. When I was very small, we used to go to Mass during Lent, and one of the local churches, if you were lucky enough to arrive 2 or 3 minutes before Mass, it was fantastic, because the priest was distributing communion. You received communion and you were delighted, because it meant you could leave the Mass at communion time and go home. Yeah, it was okay. I can understand it. We were all delighted to be able to go home early. But looking back on it, it was kind of strange. And my fear is that we just need to be careful. It isn't in the tradition. What we have in the tradition of the church is communion is brought to the sick as an expression of the Sunday assembly, taking in those who are sick. So we have that tradition. But if you go through it, we don't really have the tradition of communion just being distributed separately.
I suppose one other thing I would say to you is, what some reaction to the liturgies of the word would have been, sure, if I wanted to say prayers, I could stay at home. That's
the point. I mean, I think that's the point. We have to be very careful, of course, that from the very beginning, the church has always recognised the value of 2 or 3 Christians coming together in the name of Jesus, that is a worshipping community. So that one of the things that we have in the church, which the Second Vatican Council has tried to revamp, but maybe not so successfully, is what we call the prayers of the church. That is, all the prayers, morning prayer, evening prayer, office of readings, etc., that we often think priests and nuns say, but in fact they're prayers of the church, and they're prayers of people coming together, praying together. And I think that's something that we have to acknowledge, that we have to be careful the culture of individualism doesn't enter into our spiritual life.
And of course, the thing about it is that these whole, if you like, these liturgies of the word, they're there to assist in parishes, although I suppose the uptake depends very much on the requirement from the relevant parish priest. Hopefully with the pastoral units it'll be a bit more common, and once it becomes more common, people become more used to it, then it creates a degree of acceptance. I know recently you had a meeting in West Limerick in the Desmond Complex in Newcastle West, and I know that a lot of people were throwing a lot of questions at you, and one of them was a question which I myself have a view on, and it was the question in relation to bringing in priests from abroad. Now, my own take on it is, and this is coming from experience of working 3 years in central Uganda in a diocese where requests were coming from foreign dioceses for priests to be released to assist, and it brought an awful lot of harm to the diocese itself, because it's the local diocese that's funding their training, And then there is a need in African or Indian dioceses for their own priests. But your own take on whether or not we should have foreign priests in Limerick?
Well, we looked at this at the Synod, and the general decision at the Synod was where we can sometimes help priests. For instance, they want to come and study, or they want to improve their English, or have a break for a few years. Yes, we can be grateful that we can have the services of those priests for 2 or 3 years, whatever. So, yes, we might have some priests coming for a limited amount of time, but certainly we were agreed at the Synod that we wouldn't have a general policy of taking in loads of priests for a long-term project. And some of the reasons, I think, are what you've mentioned there.
I suppose the one thing we must remember in all of this discussion is, we're not a charity, we're not a company. At the end of the day, we're church. And I suppose what we have to remember when we're talking about anything to do with the pastoral units, it's how we as a community can come together as a praying community, as a faith community. I suppose for you, what do you think is one of the key, or a couple of the key things that people should remember in relation to how this is going to work out in the next while?
Well, the key things we have to remember, I think, is what Pope Francis reminds us of, that the purpose of the church, above all, is to encounter with Jesus Christ, the person of Jesus Christ. That must always be central. And that the person of Jesus Christ is never a static encounter. It sends us out, to go outside ourselves in mission. So I think going forward, we will have to deepen our faith on the one hand. At the same time, we'll have to cooperate more with others that perhaps before we didn't cooperate with, neighbouring parishes, whatever. Of course, it's not that we ignore them, but to actually work with them and to do so in a spirit of communion. And there, I think we will have to find moments, occasions to have sharing of faith. It's not enough simply to be people of faith. We need, in our time, to be able to share it.
You spoke about the fact that, in when it comes to implementing this and communities coming together, some of it will have to be decided by the teams on the ground. Now, can I put it to you, Bishop, that maybe we might need a little more direction from the centre in this regard? So, for example, a couple of years ago, many parishes in the diocese, we went through what we call the sit, kneel, stand routine. Everyone got used to the new gestures at Mass during the liturgy of the Eucharist, during the liturgy of Mass. But at the same time, we still have parishes that are not doing that. So it's very confusing for people when there's no consistency. When you go, if you're visiting a parish and there's no consistency. Like I myself, the best example I can give of that is actually St. Teresa's Church on Clarendon Street in Dublin. It's the church that's just off of Grafton Street. And if you go to Mass there, it gets almost comical because people have no idea, because you have people from all over the country that go to that particular Mass, and it distracts from the celebration of the Eucharist. Given that there's going to be quite a degree of local autonomy or subsidiarity, if you like, but at the same time, do we also need to kind of set some basic ground rules, if you like?
Yeah, well, we have discussed this with with the priests and with the parish councils that I've met. The need for guidelines around different elements of these pastoral units. I think that's accepted by everybody. Mm-hmm. Yes, we do.
Okay. And when do we think we might have those?
Now, in the next months. I think equally we have to allow space and creativity for people. But certainly, I accept also there is a need for clarity. So they will have to start. We have to work on them now. We have started working on them. Please God, in January we might have some of them ready.
In the pastoral letter that you sent out, you spoke about the challenges that Catholics in Ireland have had over the last 12 months. In particular, of course, we're thinking of the repeal of the Eighth. And I think it's fair to say, and obviously there are ongoing scandals internationally in the Church, particularly in the United States at the moment. And I think it's fair to say that for a lot of practicing Catholics in the diocese, as they come towards the end of 2018, it's been a very bruising year, in terms of understanding our place in Irish society and kind of the way that we see society going around us. And, many people, particularly with the scandals, might be holding on to their relationship both with their institutional church but also their faith with their fingertips. What would you say to people that would be listening this morning and would be saying, yeah, that's where I'm at this minute in time?
Well, first of all, I want to acknowledge it because it's very real, and I know a lot of people have expressed that to me. And there are people who are very, very rattled, and I appreciate that completely. Which of us cannot say we were very upset and more than that upset by a lot of the developments that went on this year, from the repeal of the Eighth to the Cardinal McCarrick scandal in the United States and others. And then, I suppose, the pre-papal visit, we had a huge amount of negativity about the Church. So it has been difficult. It has been very difficult. Nevertheless, there was one of those moments in the Pope's visit that I found personally very moving. Was the very last event, effectively, was he met the bishops on his way to the airport, and I thought, spoke from his heart when he said, look, the church has also been through humiliations. He said, let's remember we are people who follow the humiliated one. In other words, Christ was humiliated. And he was humiliated. It's not easy to be humiliated. But at the same time, we're people of faith, that through that came the resurrection, through that came a third day, and through that came a new beginning. So perhaps all that's going on at the moment, which for us might be a trial, we're hanging on by our fingertips, but if we really remain faithful and constant, he will be able to work, and we obviously offer him our suffering, he will be able to offer and through us work to bring about something new in the church, and that's what's important.
I suppose one of the things we need to be careful of as a praying community, as a faith community in Ireland, is there will be a tendency, I suppose, to circle the wagons and kind of, to draw back a small bit to recover, and that's to allow healing, as you said, from the bruising that people will have encountered throughout the year. But I suppose the thing we have to remind ourselves, of course, is that we are called to go out.
Very much so. And that is true. I mean, it's true to say that it's only by going outside, not who am I, but who am I for. It's by, as Christians, we can never give up the mission that we have. Our mission is always to love, to build peace, to build up the human family. And no matter how many contradictory things happen, we still have to pick ourselves up and go out and do that.
Okay. Bishop Brendan, listen, thank you very much for that. And one final question for you, and I'm just going to throw this at you and see. Did you see this week's Irish Catholic by any chance? No. Okay. You may not be aware, there was an analysis done for the successor to Diarmuid Martin, and your own name was mentioned as number 2 in the listing. What's your reaction to that?
Look, I'm here in Limerick. I'm destined to be here in Limerick for another 17 years, I think.
Right.
So that's my perspective on it at the moment. So that's...
As they'd say down in West Cork, you were going to be buried with our people. Thank you, Bishop Brendan, very much for coming into the programme on this Sunday morning.
So again, thanks to Bishop Brendan for sharing his time with us to speak with us this morning. And now we'll go for a second piece of music, and this one is entitled The Hills of the Earth Rejoice by Christ Church Cathedral in St. Lawrence. So let's hear this.
Sacred Space,